On October 9, 1942, at an altitude of 20,000 feet above a jungle-covered island known as Guadalcanal, a remarkable event unfolded. Over the skies of Guadalcanal, a 22-year-old U.S. aviator named Marion Carl was battling to survive. He was piloting a Grumman F-4F Wildcat, a compact and weighty fighter designed for carrier operations, and at that moment he was the one being pursued. Chasing him was a Mitsubishi A6M0, an aircraft so light and maneuverable it seemed almost futuristic. The Zero could pivot within a space half the diameter of the Wildcat's turning circle. It could ascend with the speed of a rocket. For the entire previous year, this fighter had been a spectral presence, dominating the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. Marion Carl was an experienced ace, yet at this moment he was merely prey. The Zero was glued to his tail. Marion forced his Wildcat into a steep dive. The bulky American fighter picked up velocity, yet the Zero matched him every step of the way. He banked sharply to the right. The Wildcat followed, but sluggishly, responding with a delayed, heavy feel, almost like a P-38, soft and mushy. The Zero pilot was already there, predicting his maneuver, the cannons flashing ominously. Carl's cockpit erupted in an explosion. Fragments tore into his leg, and his controls failed completely. The plane was descending uncontrollably. He somehow managed to eject, plunging into waters filled with sharks, surviving only by a stroke of sheer luck. This was the harsh truth of the air war over the Pacific. This was Guadalcanal. Yet, only a few weeks later, another young man from a South Dakota farm would take to the same skies and alter the course of events. It wasn't a war, it was a meat grinder, a place where American pilots were sent, one after another, into the jaws of the Japanese war machine. The American media dubbed the pilots stationed there the Cactus Air Force. The pilots themselves referred to their base, Henderson Field, as the graveyard. The issue wasn't only the Zero, it was the doctrine. The experts back in America, the engineers, had a straightforward solution: never turn with a Zero. It was the same tactic taught to P-38 pilots: use your speed, rely on your armor, dive, shoot, and escape. Yet in the chaotic, swirling dogfights over Guadalcanal, that doctrine was costing men their lives every single day. The Japanese pilots were experienced veterans. They had fought over China and Pearl Harbor. They knew their aircraft intimately. They lured the Americans into turning fights. They understood that the Wildcat was slow to respond. They knew precisely where to fire. The Americans were suffering devastating losses. What the Cactus Air Force didn't realize, and what the veteran Japanese pilots could not possibly anticipate, was that a solution was coming. But it wasn't a brand new aircraft. It wasn't a fresh doctrine sent from Washington. It was a 27-year-old farmer, a man so modest that he had been told he was too old to serve in combat. A man who had learned marksmanship not from a military manual, but by hunting jackrabbits across the frozen plains of South Dakota. This is the story of Joseph J. Foss and the simple, overlooked farmer's technique that propelled him to become America's ace of aces. To truly understand how a single farmer could strike fear into the Japanese Air Force, you first need to understand the farm. Joe Foss was not a professional soldier. He was born in 1915 on a remote, unelectrified farm near Sioux Falls, South Dakota. His early years were not spent inside classrooms. They were spent outdoors, in the dirt, enduring the cold, and facing the relentless wind. This was a true David versus Goliath story, much like Simo Haihai's. But Foss's Goliath wasn't only the enemy, it was life itself. The Great Depression struck South Dakota like a relentless artillery barrage. The land turned to dust, and the crops failed. The family had almost nothing. Foss's childhood, forged with relentless grit, was shaped by necessity. He and his father hunted to put food on the table. This is where the secret skill began. When 12-year-old Joe Foss hunted jackrabbits, he didn't have a rifle scope. He had only an old shotgun and one strict rule from his father: don't waste shells. Jackrabbits never run straight. They weave, dart, and reverse direction. To hit one, you couldn't aim at its current position, you had to aim where it was going to be. This technique is called deflection shooting. While other children were learning arithmetic, Foss was mentally calculating lead, windage, and velocity in a fraction of a second. He wasn't merely a skilled shooter, he was a predator. He grasped the science behind hitting a moving target. This was his iron sight. This was his precision like a piano wire. It was a farmer's eye, instinctive, something no military manual could teach. But Foss didn't want to simply hunt rabbits. His dream was to fly. In 1933, his father took him to an airshow, where he watched a Marine Corps squadron maneuver biplanes in the sky. At 18, he was instantly captivated. He told his father, "That's what I'm going to do." The path ahead seemed impossible. He was just a poor farm boy with little formal education. When tragedy struck and his father was killed by a downed power line, Joe, at 19, had to leave school to manage the farm. He felt trapped, yet his grit remained unbroken. He labored on the farm during the day while attending night classes. It took him 6 years to earn enough credits to enter college. He worked his way through school washing dishes to fund his pilot's license. By the time Pearl Harbor was attacked, Joe Foss was 26 years old. He rushed to enlist in the Navy with the goal of becoming a pilot. But he was rejected. He was deemed too old. In 1941, the maximum age for a fighter pilot was 25. They offered him a position as a flight instructor instead to teach younger men to fly. The rejection was crushing. It felt like the engineering officer telling McKenna that the cables were within specifications, or the experts instructing Simo Häyhä to rely on a scope. The official doctrine declared him unfit for combat. But Foss did what McKenna had done: he defied the rules. He discovered a loophole. He joined the Marine Corps Reserve and became an instructor. For 9 long months, he watched 20-year-old trainees he had taught being sent into battle. Foss was furious. He relentlessly pressured his superiors, demanded combat, wrote letters, and made his dissatisfaction known. By his own admission, he became the loudest, most insistent, and most irritating instructor in the Navy. Eventually, just to silence him, they relented. He was sent to advanced fighter training and assigned to a new squadron. He was assigned to VMF 121. In October 1942, while Marion Carl was being shot out of the sky, 27-year-old Grandpa Joe Foss, the farmer considered too old from South Dakota, boarded a transport ship. His destination, Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. What he found upon arrival was far from a conventional military base. It was hell on earth. The moment he stepped off the plane, the thick, humid air hit him, carrying a pungent mix of engine oil, decaying jungle, and death. The runway was a battered strip of dirt and gravel, hacked out of the palm trees. The operations center consisted of a wooden shack called the pagoda. Pilots slept in tents with muddy floors, and wreckage littered the entire area. Dozens of F-4F Wildcats and P-39s were piled haphazardly along the edges of the runway, their wings ripped, engines ruined, and cockpits stained. This was the infamous graveyard of the Cactus Air Force. Foss was assigned to his tent and met the men he would fly alongside. They weren't the fresh-faced youngsters he had instructed, they were spectral remnants. Their skin was jaundiced from atabrine, the anti-malaria medication. Their eyes were bloodshot from sleepless nights. Their flight suits were smeared with sweat and grease. They were seasoned veterans, yet hunted and haunted. Then Foss, the older man, the farmer, stepped in. All eyes turned to him. He was fresh meat, just another replacement for the body they had lost yesterday. Foss approached his assigned aircraft, a Grumman F-4F Wildcat, the very same model Marion Carl had been shot down in. It was bulky, sluggish, and by all accounts, a flying coffin when facing a zero. The squadron's executive officer, a man named Duke, gave Foss the routine briefing, the same one that had been getting pilots killed. Never turn with a zero. Never. Foss listened, nodded, and absorbed the instructions. He understood the doctrine, but he also grasped something it overlooked. He understood jackrabbits. The following morning, Foss took to the skies on his first mission, heading straight into the kill zone. He was a farmer strapped into a flying coffin, about to confront the most advanced fighter in the world. And he was about to rely on a trick that no manual ever taught. Joe Foss's maiden flight over Guadalcanal wasn't practice, it was a baptism by fire. Climbing to 15,000 feet, his eyes swept the endless blue above. The squadron's ghosts had warned him, they come out of the sun. You never see them until they're shooting. Leading his first patrol, Foss felt blind, unprepared. Then the radio crackled, bandits, 11 o'clock high. Foss looked up and saw them, a formation of Mitsubishi Zeros diving at incredible speed, faster than anything he had ever encountered. He remembered the orders: never turn. Dive and run. Foss shoved the stick forward, driving his Wildcat into a screaming dive. The heavy American fighter gained speed. The Zeros pursued. One opened fire, tracers streaked past Foss's canopy, close enough to make him flinch. He kept his Wildcat diving all the way to the jungle canopy, shaking the Zeros from his tail. He returned to Henderson Field, hands trembling, not from fear, but from fury. The doctrine was flawed. He knew it. Survival wasn't achieved by running. And Joe Foss had not come to Guadalcanal merely to survive. He had come to Guadalcanal to hunt. On October 13th, just days after arriving, Foss led another patrol. This time, they encountered a formation of Japanese bombers escorted by Zeros. Chaos erupted in the sky. Wildcats and Zeros twisted and turned violently. Foss noticed a Zero locking onto his wingman's tail, closing in for the kill. Doctrine dictated that Foss should dive away, seek an easier target. But the farmer's instincts told him something different. Foss rolled his Wildcat sharply. He didn't aim at the Zero itself, he aimed where the jackrabbit would go. He squeezed the trigger. His 6.50 caliber machine guns erupted. He unleashed a long 3-second burst, not at the enemy aircraft, but at a patch of empty sky about 200 feet ahead. It seemed like a mistake, a wasted shot, yet the Japanese pilot was focused on his prey and never noticed Foss. Foss executed a flawless tight turn, flying straight into the path of the .50 caliber rounds. The Zero's wing detached. The plane disintegrated in a blaze of metal and fire. It was Foss's first kill. He hadn't outturned the Zero, nor had he outrun it, he had outthought it. He had applied the farmer's logic, the technique the experts in Washington had overlooked. Landing at Henderson Field, he was a changed man. The ghosts of his squadron gathered around him. He had achieved his first victory. He told his crew chief, "This plane, it's a truck, but it's a tough truck, and it shoots straight." To his fellow pilots, he said, "Forget what they told you. Don't chase them. Lead them. Lead them until you think you're going to miss, then lead them some more. They will fly right into it." This was the piano wire modification. This was the iron sight logic. It wasn't a mechanical alteration to the aircraft, it was a mental adjustment. It was a farmer's confidence. The pilots paid attention. They were desperate. Their ace, Marion Carl, was still recuperating. They needed a leader, and this 27-year-old farmer was the only one speaking of hunting, not retreating. Foss assumed command of his fleet of 8 Wildcats. They were a collection of misfits, the cast-offs, the new arrivals. They didn't have a cool nickname. Observing this elderly man lead his chaotic squadron, the press coined one for them. They called the group Foss's Flying Circus. On October 16th, the circus went into action. Foss guided his 8 planes directly into a formation of 32 Japanese aircraft. Foss's group of 8 faced a force of 32 to 8. It was a death sentence. But Foss already had a strategy. He had no intention of entering a turning fight. He intended to rely on the same farmer's logic that had shaped his instincts. He commanded his formation to employ the thatch weave, a new maneuver where pilots flew in pairs and guarded one another's tails. Foss dove into the enemy formation. He spotted a Zero. He didn't attempt to turn with it. He aimed ahead of its flight path, fired, and the Zero erupted. Another Zero dropped down behind him. The wingman paired with Foss and the weave saw the threat. He rolled over and blasted the Zero off Foss's tail. The flying circus operated like a single coordinated machine. In 10 minutes of vicious, chaotic combat, Foss's squadron of 8 destroyed 5 Japanese aircraft. Foss personally claimed 2. The entire group returned to base with all 8 planes intact. The graveyard suddenly looked like it was winning. The tallies began to rise faster than anyone could imagine. It was Simo Haiho's unbelievable streak all over again. On October 18th, Foss downed 2 more. On October 20th, he shot another one from the sky. By October 23rd, only 10 days after his first victory, Joe Foss had achieved ace status with 5 kills. On October 25th, he destroyed 3 Zeros in a single day. The old man, the quiet farmer, had become the most lethal pilot on Guadalcanal. He wasn't merely fighting, he was guiding others. His flying circus now dominated the airspace. But as with Simo Haiha, achievements like this demanded sacrifice. The Japanese were enraged. They were losing aircraft at a rate that defied logic. Their seasoned pilots were being brought down by Wildcats' aircraft they believed inferior. Nothing about it added up. And one name kept appearing again and again in intercepted communications: Foss. The Japanese command began paying attention. The sky was crowded with aircraft. Foss brought down 2 Zeros. He was preparing to take a shot at a third when his Wildcat was suddenly torn apart by cannon shells striking from the rear. His engine detonated, and his cockpit instantly filled with smoke. He was falling fast. He managed to eject just in time, his fighter smashing into the jungle below. He was recovered, shaken, but alive. Only 2 days later, he returned to the skies. This time he was pursuing a Japanese float plane. He was so locked in on finishing the target that he never noticed the rear gunner on the Japanese Jake. The gunner opened fire, and the rounds destroyed Foss's engine. For the second time in under 72 hours, his aircraft was finished. But he wasn't above the jungle now, he was above open water. He crash-landed his Wildcat in the sea. The aircraft struck the surface violently and disappeared beneath the waves in under half a minute. Foss found himself stranded in the vast Pacific, roughly 10 miles from shore. He was in the slot, a stretch of ocean notorious for being one of the most shark-filled waters on the planet. Wearing only his life jacket, he drifted as the sea around him grew colder. His determination, his stubborn, farm-hardened endurance, kept him steady. He had grown up waiting out storms and surviving hardship. But then he saw them, fins. Many of them. Sharks. They circled him relentlessly, brushing against him as they passed. Foss, the man who had stalked Zero fighters, was now the prey of creatures far more ancient. He kept himself afloat, watching as the fins edged closer. He had no gun, no radio, nothing but the toughness he had learned on the farm. For 4 long hours he bobbed in the water, surrounded. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, a small canoe appeared. It was paddled by local islanders who had been sent by an Australian coast watcher who, by pure chance, had witnessed his aircraft crash. The islanders rowed hard toward him, striking the water with their paddles to drive the sharks away. They pulled the frozen, exhausted pilot out of the sea. When they finally returned him to Henderson Field, Foss was barely holding himself together, physically and mentally shattered. He was weakened from the elements and battling malaria. The medical staff grounded him immediately. Joe Foss, the top ace, was confined to a hospital cot. His flying circus now had to take to the skies without him. The Japanese were convinced he had been killed. They thought the phantom of Guadalcanal had finally disappeared. They were mistaken. Joe Foss lay there for 14 days, burning with fever, trembling uncontrollably, and thinking about only one thing: the jackrabbits were slipping away. When his strength returned, he got up, walked out of the infirmary, strapped into a fresh Wildcat, and on November 30th, he went back on the hunt. He brought down another Zero. The phantom had returned, and he was furious. The Japanese hurled every resource they possessed at him. He refused to stop. By January 15, 1943, Joe Foss's total had climbed to 23. He was now a mere 3 victories away from breaking the ultimate American milestone, the one set in the First World War by the legendary Eddie Rickenbacker. Rickenbacker's achievement, 26 kills, was sacred, a figure untouched by any pilot. And now, a 27-year-old farm kid from South Dakota flying what many called a death trap was on the brink of surpassing it. By early January 1943, the name Joe Foss had become a myth on Guadalcanal. But it was a myth built on fatigue and sickness. The once too old farmer, now pushing 27, was physically destroyed. The malaria he had caught earlier had surged back with brutal intensity. He flew sorties while burning with fever that never broke. Each time he returned to Henderson Field, his Wildcat riddled with holes, the crew would see him trembling so violently from chills that they had to help lift his soaked body out of the cockpit. He was fighting 2 battles, one high above the Pacific against Japanese pilots, and another inside his own bloodstream against the relentless malaria parasite. And somehow, he was winning both. His count had reached 23. The legendary World War I ace Eddie Rickenbacker's record was 26. That number, 26, was more than a figure. It was an Everest, a symbol of the highest American triumph in aviation. For 20 years, no one had come close. And now, a half-dazed farm kid from South Dakota, flying an aircraft many considered a metal coffin, was moments from reaching the summit. January 15, 1943. This was the day Joe Foss was ill, far more ill than he had ever been before. The doctors had strictly ordered him to stay on the ground, but he refused to listen. Forcing himself into the cockpit, his skull throbbing with pain, he prepared to fly. Word had spread quickly: a massive Tokyo Express, an enormous Japanese naval convoy, was approaching the island, shielded by a large force of fighter aircraft. Foss and his flying circus were launched to intercept them. The sky darkened as wave after wave of aircraft filled the air. It became the largest aerial clash Foss had ever witnessed. Zeros and Wildcats twisted together in a violent storm of combat. Foss, his vision clouded by fever, relied only on instinct, on the lessons from the farm. He spotted a Zero moving in behind one of his wingmen. He didn't think, he acted. He rolled his Wildcat not toward the Zero, but toward the exact open space where the jackrabbit target would appear. He opened fire. His .50 caliber guns tore through the supposedly empty air. The Zero, fully committed to its maneuver, flew straight into the incoming stream of bullets. It shattered instantly. Kill number 24. He swept the battlefield again. Another Zero was diving toward another group of Wildcats. Foss pushed his throttle to its limit, the engine howling as he cut off the attacker's path. The Japanese pilot tried to shake him with the classic Zero outturn strategy. Foss refused to fall for it. Instead, he executed a high-side pass, the move he had mastered. He rolled above the Zero, dropped in from its blind spot, and fired a short, flawless burst. The Zero's engine erupted. Kill number 25. He had matched Rickenbacker's record. Foss was now, without doubt, a legend in the sky. But he wasn't finished. He spotted another Japanese aircraft, a rough floatplane fighter, trying to slip away from the chaos. Foss plunged after it. The rough pilot noticed him and yanked into a steep, desperate climbing turn. The .50 caliber bullet streaked forward in a flawless trajectory, intersecting precisely with the point in the sky where the rough was attempting to escape. The rounds struck the cockpit dead on. The aircraft spiraled downward, flipping repeatedly before plunging into the Pacific Ocean that became kill number 26. In one single afternoon, while trembling violently from malaria, Joe Foss had destroyed 3 enemy planes. He had not only equaled the impossible record, he had surpassed it. When he brought his Wildcat down at Henderson Field, the entire airstrip was gathered there to meet him. The once grim graveyard of shattered planes had transformed into a place of triumph. The so-called ghosts of the Cactus Air Force lifted the two-old farmer from his cockpit and hoisted him onto their shoulders. He was now undeniably the ace of aces of the United States. But while the flyers on Guadalcanal celebrated him, the Japanese leadership in Rabaul grieved. This moment became their Saburo Sakai-style shock, their Pavel Diary moment, their internal reckoning. 4 months, Japanese pilots had flown with total assurance. They were operating the A6M0, a technological masterpiece. They were seasoned fighters. They believed the F-4F Wildcat was outclassed. They had already shot down many of them. Their approach was straightforward: force the Wildcat into a turning contest, slide onto it 6 o'clock, and destroy it. Experienced Japanese aviators would return to their carriers visibly rattled, their faces drained of color, their hands trembling. They described encounters that sounded unbelievable. They said they would swoop down on a Wildcat expecting it to flee, but it didn't. They said they tried to lure it into a turning fight, but it refused to take the bait. Instead, the American fighter would perform odd maneuvers, rolling, climbing, or diving in unpredictable patterns, firing bursts into apparently empty air. And then, moments later, the Zero flying beside them would erupt into flames. They found themselves being pursued by a mindset shaped by a farmer's instincts, something they simply could not grasp. Joe Foss had achieved for aviation what Simo Häyhä achieved on the battlefield: he stripped the enemy of every single advantage. Simo vanished by concealing his rifle's shine and masking his breath. Foss made his intentions disappear by refusing to ever aim directly at the opponent's aircraft. The Japanese pilots realized they were battling a phantom. They were confronting an invisible adjustment not crafted from piano wire, but created inside the mind of a hunter from South Dakota. Foss had personally shattered their confidence. He had shown that the Zero, long believed to be unstoppable, was anything but. He proved that the seemingly inferior Wildcat, when flown by someone who understood the science of anticipating movement the way a jackrabbit does, became the most lethal machine in the sky. The Japanese veterans who once chased Wildcats for sport were suddenly hesitant. They approached cautiously. The Cactus Air Force was no longer prey. It had become the predator. And all of it centered on one man who had once been dismissed as too old to serve in combat. But this triumph carried a devastating price. This was the cost, the equivalent of the explosive round that Simo Häyhä endured. Foss's price wasn't a single piece of shrapnel. It was a slow, punishing breakdown of his body. Only days after surpassing the record, Foss was permanently grounded. The malaria finally overtook him. He had become so ill he could barely remain on his feet. The fevers returned with crippling intensity. He had shed more than 30 pounds. The man who had faced down Japanese Zeros and braved shark-infested waters was now being consumed from within by illness. He did not depart Guadalcanal in a triumphant parade. Instead, he was carried away on a stretcher, a gaunt figure with yellowed skin, his body battered and broken by the very island he had fought to protect. Foss was transported to hospitals across the Pacific before finally returning to the United States. Though celebrated as a national hero, he was also an invalid. Yet Joe Foss possessed that sisu, the relentless determination and grit of a farmer. He spent months recovering in a naval hospital in San Diego, and it was there that the country he had defended formally recognized him. On May 18, 1943, Joe Foss, the farmer from South Dakota, stood inside the White House as President Franklin D. Roosevelt pinned the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award, around his neck. The official citation lauded his fearless courage and unmatched skill in aerial combat. But Foss's true legacy extended far beyond medals. What he created was hope. In 1942, America was struggling, the Zero seemed invincible, and the Japanese were regarded as unstoppable. Joe Foss, with 26 confirmed kills in just 44 days, shattered that perception. He proved that an American farm boy flying an American plane could defeat the very best the enemy had to offer. Foss didn't merely contribute to a single battle, he rewrote the rules of air combat. The techniques he perfected, deflection shooting, precise lead, and the thatch weave, became standard doctrine for the entire Pacific Fleet. He had saved Guadalcanal, and in doing so, helped shift the course of the war itself. And what becomes of a man who earns the title of Ace of Aces once the conflict ends? Unlike Sergeant McKenna, whose innovations remained secret, Joe Foss's heroism was publicly celebrated. Yet, like Simo Haiha, the farmer, he never lost sight of his roots. In 1954, that same farmer, once told he wasn't capable, was elected governor of South Dakota. He served his state with the same dedication he had shown his country. Later, he became the first commissioner of the American Football League and grew into a beloved national figure. Yet at his core, he remained that farm boy, the man who understood the simple, unflinching logic of the hunt. Wars are not truly won by experts or engineers reading manuals, but by those who notice flaws and act decisively. James McKenna, the mechanic, saw a defect in a P-38's control cable, a 3 to 8-inch slack that meant certain death, and corrected it with a 6-inch piece of piano wire. Simo Haiha, the sniper, recognized a flaw in doctrine. The high-tech scope's glint betrayed his position. He solved it with the dependable iron sights he knew so well. And Joe Foss, the farm boy, spotted a weakness in his underpowered plane. He realized that outturning a Zero was impossible, but outthinking it was achievable. He fixed it not with tools, but with the farmer's eye he had honed over a lifetime. These are the forgotten chapters, the stories of men who broke rules to survive and win. Joe Foss passed away in 2003 at the age of 87. He was laid to rest with full military honors, celebrated as a hero by his nation, a legend in the Marine Corps, and a testament to the indomitable sisu, the grit, of the American farmer. If you found this story as compelling as we did, take a moment to like this video. It allows us to share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Every story matters. Every story deserves to be remembered. We'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Our community stretches from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you're part of something extraordinary here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.